X-rays. It's a special, something like a MRI scan you have to do to actually bring up the fissures, the weaknesses in the bones that is caused by these rays. The bones are weakened, and that is why we're now seeing in New Zealand here incidences of cows with broken legs. They break the forearm, the big bone, which is one of the biggest bones in the body, and they just fall over. They broke their bones because there are bones sitting down in Massey University waiting for the money to get the research to follow this through. But my research at the moment is that fluoride, that formation of fluoride, because the animals get it from eating the soil, they can eat up to 10% of their intake from soil, and that contains the fluoride. Every ton of superphosphate that goes on will provide 40 kilograms per hectare of fluoride. Okay. Thank you.
Right, so your 10 minutes is actually up, so I'm just going to take one question from Councillor Boss, and that's all we'll have time for. So.
I have a small property which I have animals on,
yep.
Yearlings, and they on trickle feed. So the trickle feed comes from Hamilton,
right.
Goes into my water tank. It's obviously diluted because rainwater goes in there as well,
mm-hmm.
and my stock drink it.
Mm-hmm.
I've tried to check my cows for fluorosis on their teeth, but I can't find any.
Mm-hmm.
But what other has any tests been done on animals that drink fluoridated water to see if there is any problems?
There's no test being. Well, yes, there are. If you speak to me afterwards during the break, I'll give you two websites, which was in the Fluoride Research magazine, which was about the experiences of a woman who had a horse stud in America, and she moved to a place where they had fluoridated water, and it shows you that. And they did tests. The only way you can do is actually test the bones. If you send them to the works, the animals, and get the bones tested, you'll see the increase in fluoride in the bone. That's where it is. Clinical signs, you get the clinical signs in
okay,
when we after
Sorry,
reappear.
we do have to keep strictly time, but can I suggest that you give that information to the committee secretary, because all of the councillors, I think, will be interested in receiving that information in terms of the animals.
Yep.
So thank you for coming along.
Yep.
I think you're the first vet we've had presenting, so thank you for doing that. Okay, the next speaker is Rob Hamill, and Rob is speaking on behalf of Moira Turner. Hello Rob, how are you? Welcome along. So Rob, you've got 10 minutes, and that does include questions, and we do need to keep strictly to the time. So
I think I'll use that. No, well, I won't use that, so I don't think we'll have any problems. Kia ora koutou, greetings, Your Worship, councillors. Thank you for the time. And thank you for putting this tribunal together. I'm not going to go into the efficacy of fluoride in the water. I'm not going to go into the scientific side of things, and I think you've already had enough of that from the experts. And I think there will be some more today anyway. Look, I just really want to focus on one area, and that is dosage. And from my perspective, I used to be an athlete, and when I was training, preparing for the Olympics and what have you, the dosage I would have been ingesting, I just don't know what it was. Nowadays, if I'm not training or doing anything active, I'm drinking a couple, maybe 3 or 4 glasses of water a day. Back when I was training, I was probably drinking, anywhere from 5 to 8 litres a day. And I think for anyone who's an athlete now, my wife's an athlete now, 7 years ago, was it 8 years ago, the referendum was held by council? It was roughly 7 or 8 years ago on whether water should be fluoridated, and unfortunately it came back with a yes. What was the ratio? Can anyone tell me? 60-40? 70-30? And at that time, we had a child, a young baby. We decided to shift out of Hamilton. It was one of there were several reasons, but that was one of the major reasons we actually shifted out of Hamilton City. And I mean, that was not an easy decision to make, because we had a young child and we couldn't think of any other way other than perhaps catching rainwater to feed our child non-fluoridated water. Not really understanding if the fluoride removal systems you can purchase would be that effective. So that's about it. I have real concerns about the dosage that babies are getting. You heard Paul Connett talk about 200 times the amount of fluoride in water that is in mother's breast milk. That for me is just, there's debate over. You know, why can the precautionary principle not kick in at this point? We're talking about babies here. The precautionary principle must surely be considered the number one issue here. The precautionary principle. And I guess the solution, do you know that that feeling you get when you're in the middle of an argument and you realise that you're wrong? It's an awful feeling, isn't it? And I actually have to say that some people at the DHB, I reckon there'll be people in the DHB and perhaps in council who have held a pro view of retaining fluoride in the water will be thinking, oh, I might be wrong. And it's a difficult process to go through, isn't it, psychologically, to actually change your tack. You want to save face, but for the DHB in particular, and all that historical stuff, and of course then there's the reality of, can we trust the DHB for other decisions that they're making on behalf of our health? Well, they're just going to have to tough it out and take it on the chin, because the reality is I think it should be removed. Our choices are being taken away. It's a medication, we're being mass medicated, and I'd like to think we could make the right decision. Thanks.
Right, thank you, Rob. Any questions for Rob? No, there's no questions for you, Rob, so thank you very much for coming along. Well done. Right, the next speaker is Michael Godfrey. Okay, so Michael, good to go?
Thank you.
So Michael, we've got 10 minutes including questions for you. Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, you have my commiserations for having to sit through this ordeal. Have a thought for us, though, that over the last 25, 35 years or so have been battling bureaucracy and commercial interests, because we've spent a huge amount of time, effort and money in trying to get the truth out regarding fluoridation. I was involved 25 years ago in getting it out of Tauranga, and strangely enough, there hasn't been a huge increase in dental costs, as forecast here 6 years ago by Mr. Ludbrook of the Waikato District Health Board, warning there'd be huge increase in children's decay. It hasn't occurred in Tauranga. Because dental decay is not a fluoride deficiency disease. And I think by now you'll know that it's due to sugar, and it's sugar in the blood, in fact. And that's been proven by dental research by Professor in California, who showed this in the 1960s. It's been widely promoted, and still is, as 25% dental decay, reduction in dental decay, even 40 to 50% by a previous Minister of Health, Nick King, who was an ex-dental nurse. But this is actually in real terms, as proven by dental research, trying to show that fluoride prevents dental decay in children, and then in the latest one that came out in Australia, Slade and Spencer, just this year, where they've had it for 45 years, so they've done lifetime exposure, and they've managed to show one filling, and we saw that presented yesterday. It's only one filling, a lifetime exposure. Over the years, there's been official requests for research into the safety of dentistry. The United States Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Register in 1993, they said that the data doesn't show that we've got safety they really have concerns about the excessive oral exposure in the drinking water. And then the NHS in England in 2000, the National Research Council in America in 2006, the Scientific Committee for Health and Environmental Research in the EU, again in this century, have complained there's insufficient scientific evidence to demonstrate that water fluoridation is safe. These are official requests, and nothing was done. Bureaucratic stability and obfuscation. They just haven't done it. And for 50 years, you can say that public health authorities have pursued a policy of population medication, and you've had this demonstrated to you yesterday, that this is medication. They're using an industrial fluoride chemical with contaminants, and there's been no research to show what effect that could have on health. Now, I wasn't here yesterday when Declan War from Ireland apparently gave a presentation by Skype, but I've been corresponding with him fairly recently, and this was his research paper. It's 140 pages long with 400 references, and it was presented in February of this year to the Republic of Ireland, the government, to EU and WHO. And very briefly, it looked at 28 different diseases and showed that in the Republic of Ireland, which had mandated fluoridation for 50 years, there was a statistically highly significant increase in these diseases, up to 470% increased incidence. You've got diabetes, obesity, dementia, endocrine, mainly thyroid problems, rheumatoid, osteoarthritis, chronic lung disease, and also SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, where New Zealand is actually higher, and congenital abnormalities. Now, we've got exactly the same health problems in New Zealand, also in Australia and in America. Huge health costs that are continually climbing, and they are not present to anywhere near that extent in the unfluoridated countries. This is what Declan War has done that should have been done in the past. I want to just look at one thing, because I've only got a few minutes. And this is not in his report, because he's only found it recently, and he's been corresponding with me about it. He looked at osteosarcoma. Now, I'm biased about osteosarcoma. It's a rare disease, fortunately. It kills young children, young boys, usually in their teens. We have about 8 or 9 a year. I personally have been involved with 2 teenage boys that died from osteosarcoma. Both of them were fluoridated, one at Mount Maunganui before they stopped fluoridation, and one at Whakatane. So I've seen this personally. We've got an incidence of male osteosarcoma that is higher in the fluoridated countries compared to the EU. More in males, but in females. And this is a chart showing, this came out in 2009, looking at the incidence, and there are 2 peaks. There's one, the main one in young adolescents, and there's another peak later on in the senior citizens. And this is an overall one looking at countries. And what Declan War showed was that if you look at the fluoridated countries, this is America, there is the same peak, slightly higher in the younger age group, but there's another one. Whoops, let's go back. And another one in the older generation, which is quite considerable. We're looking here about 4 for the EU, and you're looking at 8 or so in America. Australia, it's worse.
3 minutes.
You're looking at a significant increase. It's a very sensitive device, this. You're looking at a far greater increase in Australia. Now, I contacted the Health Department statistics just a few days ago to see what I could get about New Zealand figures, and I got figures for the older generation which are comparable to here. I sent them over to Declan War and said, yes, we have got a peak, but it's not that much. And he emailed me back almost immediately to say, if you look at these figures, they're per million. In New Zealand, the statistics from the Health Department are per 100,000. So the New Zealand figure per million is actually higher than Australia. We've got, that's the Australian one, we've got a figure that's up here in the older generation. Now, yesterday, an oncologist, Dr. Goodwin, showed you that we have about 22 deaths of cancer a day here in New Zealand. We have a high rate of cancer internationally. Hamilton has got about 4% of the population, I understand. And if my maths is right, based on osteosarcoma, this rare condition, you can expect that there will be at least 1 or 2 teenage boys that will die here in Hamilton over the next few years as a result of the fluoridation of this city. There will also be an equal number of elderly. And I think that it's about time that this practice was stopped, because it's going to take a little while for that to clear. It's all for the sake of one tooth. There's no question about that. Lifelong exposure to fluoridated water, you're going to save about one tooth. Is it worth it? I don't think so. Max Planck, the great German scientist, said that changes in science occur funeral by funeral. It takes about 50 years. We've got to wait for the professors and their students to die, or at least retire. I think we've had this for 50 years. It's time to call it quits. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got no time for questions there, so thank you very much for that presentation. Now, the next presenter...
That message, the precautionary principle.
Right. Our next presenter is Eric Blankenblill. I hope I've said that right. Come on up, Eric. Close enough. Okay, all right. Councillors, we're going to try Paul Connett after Eric's finished. You've got 10 minutes, including questions, Eric.
Well, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to speak with you on the fluoridation issue. The first comment I would like to make is you're probably wondering to yourselves that you get elected to a council to manage the usual council affairs, and here you are asked to make a decision of a medical nature which is going to be imposed upon all the citizens of your city. And naturally, when you're asked to do a thing like that, well, the first question is you will say is, well, who's asking me to do it? And it's the Ministry of Health. And you think to yourself, as we all would have a tendency to do, well, they must know what they're talking about. We should just really rubber stamp this, which is what's happened in the past. There was a very good documentary that many of you may have seen in the last few years called Let Us Spray. And that was about the Ministry of Health's involvement in the regulation of 2,4,5-T, which had a dioxin in it, which we now all know at any concentration is a mutagenic, causing birth defects. And that's exactly what happened, of course, in New Zealand, in areas where there was high concentrations, and not even high concentrations, but where people used these sprays. And the role of the Ministry of Health in managing the public relations on that is very well documented in that documentary. And I'd just like to quote you one excerpt from a confidential memo to Cabinet when the Ministry of Health was finally forced to look into 245T. George Gear, the Minister of Health, wrote to Cabinet in this memo, "The sole responsibility for the proposed committee is to allay public fears that 245T is responsible for abnormalities such as spina bifida." So this was the final outcome of years of pressure of New Zealand citizens asking the Ministry of Health, the officials who are paid to look after our health, to look into 245T and dioxin. Their only agenda was to tell us that it was all right. And even when this all came out in a documentary, nothing was done, no consequences. This is what the Ministry of Health is capable of doing. At that time, the acceptable level of concentration of dioxin in the spray was 1 part per million. That was set in 1970. It was set because the industry had managed to achieve 1 part per million. Prior to that, for the last 20 years, New Zealand was having 2 to 20 parts per million of this dioxin. And when industry could manage 1 part per million, the Ministry of Health said, well, 1 part per million is safe. And nothing would have happened if there hadn't have been public pressure, if there hadn't been protests. People like us standing before you now talking about fluoride. Very similar substance, also extremely toxic. Also with a history of being introduced into our water system at the suggestion of a consultant who was charged with, what are we going to do with this fluoride? We can't dispose of it. It's too toxic to dispose of anywhere. And there is a mantra in industry where pollution is involved. And that mantra is, the solution to pollution is dilution. Dilute it enough and we can manage it. Now, they weren't allowed to pour it into the sea. That was illegal. So let's link it to a health benefit and put it in the water. That is the history, that is the genesis of fluoridation in the United States. So just to go back to what happened with dioxin, because dioxin and fluoride are very similarly toxic substances. Every time that the pressure mounted and they had to look into it, they would respond by saying, no, it's perfectly safe, but we'll lower the threshold. So the threshold was lowered from 1970 to from 1 part per million. In 1980, I think it was lowered to 0.1 part per million. So that's a 10-fold decrease. The protests continued. The workers at the Ivan Watkinsdale plant were dying of cancer at an enormous rate. So they asked the Ministry of Health, can you look into our increased rates of cancer deaths? So this is their response to that request. Their response was, no useful purpose could be served by investigating this situation in depth. Massey University decided to do a study on it. Their findings were that depending on where you worked in the plant, your risk of dying of cancer was increased between 46% and 69% in the normal community. So then they set the safe level, as I said, at 0.1, a 10-fold drop. In the mid-1980s, New Zealand was now the last country in the world to allow the use of dioxin. It was banned in the United States in 1971. In the court cases that took place then, the New Zealand Ministry of Health sent their advisor to support the safety of dioxin for the chemical companies. But that still was not enough. The Americans saw through it. They banned it in 1971. But we carried on. We actually then subsidized it to halve the price of it and increase the use of it. Then finally, in 1983, the pressure was so great that they had to do something. So what did they do? They didn't say it was unsafe, but they said, we'll lower the level again. Another tenfold lowering of the level. That then lowered the level to a point where they couldn't make the pesticide anymore. So that they closed it down. My point is this. None of you here are doctors. None of you here are probably inclined to turn around to people and say, you must take this medicine or you must take that medicine. You've done what we should be able to do, assume that if the Ministry of Health says it's good and we need it, then that must be true. The pedigree of their actions in the past makes it clear that it's not safe to make that assumption. I'll leave it at that. I had much more to tell you, but 10 minutes is a very short period of time. What I may just wrap up with...
there might be a couple of questions.
Yeah, okay.
So you ready for those?
Yes, well, are there any questions?
Yeah, so that's what we're up to now. I just do have a couple. Have you got some qualifications in science or something, or...?
No.
No, okay. Or medical?
Well, I have qualifications in common sense.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to understand if you had any formal qualifications in science or medical stuff.
Why is that important?
It's not. I'm just checking because of the way your presentation is. I assumed that you did. That's
Okay,
all.
yeah.
And secondly, can you just... Do you live in Hamilton?
I do not live in Hamilton, no.
Whereabouts do you live?
I live in Auckland.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. All right, I just want to check that. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Questions?
My question,
Yes.
dioxin and fluoride,
Yes.
you say they're similar compounds.
Yes. Well, they're similar in their toxicity. They're both ranked as of extremely high toxicity, and it's very difficult to dispose of safely.
So the difference now between our artificial fluoride and what we used to get, or what they used to put in, the stuff that comes out the chimneys has other toxins in it. Have you seen Hamilton's test on our water?
I have not seen Hamilton's test on the water, no.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Eric, very much. That was
Okay,
very good.
well, if I just have a minute left, I'd just like to wrap up with the previous speaker mentioned that one of the issues of fluoride on you is your impact on thyroid. It's very interesting to note that doctors do use fluoride to inhibit thyroid activity. So here's a list of the effects of underactive thyroid.
Sorry, Eric,
No?
your time's up.
All right,
Sorry,
okay.
we've really got to keep strictly to time. But we've got your written submission, and if there is any information that you want to leave with Jacob for councillors to read, please do that. Thank you. Okay, we're going to call in with Paul Connor. Just a little reminder for councillors, when you're asking questions, do make sure you've got the mic in front of you, because it's not going to be picked up on the live stream unless you've got the mic in front of you to hear over the airwaves. Thanks. So we've got Paul Connett from overseas. A few seconds to... And councillors, did you get the information about the DHB website? Up and going, yeah. So they've had problems with the website. So. Are we working? Not? Here we go.
Hotel Metropolitan Sofia, добрый вечер, Даниил. Hello? Good evening. Hello.
Okay, I'm mindful that we're going to, I really do want to keep moving. So how are we going here? One more time? Okay. I do wonder whether we should record the conversation off-site and then replay it. I know that's difficult for questions, but...
Hotel Metropolitan Sofia, good evening. 523, 1 moment.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Great. Please feel free to resume your presentation. We can hear you loud and clear.
Can you just let them know that we did hear the beginning?
Thank you very much. Good.
We did hear the first 3 minutes of your presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much. In science, it must always be entertained that an ugly fact can destroy a beautiful theory. Recently, there have been several ugly facts that destroy the claims that swallowing fluoride reduces tooth decay, and it is perfectly safe to do so. I would like to mention just 2 of those ugly facts. The first one is the admission by proponents, particularly the Center for Disease Control in the United States in 1999, that the predominant action of fluoride is topical, not systemic. Previously, they thought that the fluoride had to accumulate in the teeth before they had erupted, but now they say no, the predominant action is on the surface of the tooth and not from inside the body. Once they admitted that, it should have been the end of fluoridation. It simply doesn't make sense to swallow fluoride when, if you want it, you can apply it directly to the teeth and spit it out. This way, you are reaching the target tissue while minimizing exposure to other tissues. And, of course, using this approach, you're not forcing it on people who don't want it, retaining their freedom of choice. The second ugly fact is the meta-analysis of IQ studies published by a team from Harvard University in July of 2012. I personally have been warning about the possibility that fluoride damaged the brain since 1996. And it was important that this team from Harvard has essentially validated our concerns. They looked at 27 studies which compared the IQ of children in high fluoride villages, levels in villages with high fluoride levels in the water versus villages with low levels. And in 26 of these studies, they found a lowering of IQ with an average of 7 IQ points. Now, admittedly, there were some weaknesses in some of the studies, but the overall consistency of these results was remarkable. Proponents have claimed that this only occurred for high concentrations, that where this lowering occurred was only with very high concentrations. But that's simply not true. And it also indicates that they don't understand the difference between concentration and dose. First of all, they found at least 8 of these studies, the concentration in the high fluoride village where the IQ was lowered was lower than 3 parts per million. And another study found a threshold of 1.9 parts per million. And another found an effect of 0.91 parts per million. So none of these studies at these levels provide an adequate margin of safety to protect all of New Zealand's children against the range of dose that you can anticipate in fluoridated communities. Some children drink a lot of water, some children get fluoride from other sources. And nor does it protect against the large range of sensitivity that you could expect in any large population. And we usually use, for this purpose, a margin of safety of 10. That is absolutely standard unless you're dealing with the study group is a very large population, which it was not in these cases. At the end of the day, if you decide, counsellors, to continue with fluoridation, you need to be able, in my view, to justify forcing it on people that don't want it. I don't know how you can do that, but at least in your own mind, you should be able to justify that. And secondly, you should be able to convince yourself that the benefits are large. I don't see those large benefits. We wrote 3 chapters in our book, and in the large studies, you do not see a huge difference in tooth decay between children who've grown up in fluoridated and or non-fluoridated communities. And you need to be able to convince yourself that the risks to the brain, the bone, the thyroid gland, and the other risks like osteosarcoma, all of which are documented in the National Research Council report of 2006, you have to convince yourself that you can safely ignore all those findings in the scientific literature. In my view, it is not sufficient to accept second-hand endorsements from other agencies, no matter how prestigious they may be. This is essentially hearsay evidence if you haven't yourself looked at the primary evidence. And I should point out that none of the people that are urging you to continue fluoridation accept any liability for any harm caused. They only give you advice. They do not provide any indemnity against harm, which includes the Ministry of Health. You are the only ones who can be held responsible if there's any legal action in the future. It's entirely on your shoulders. And you better, I think, be absolutely certain of the things I've said, that you can justify forcing it on people that don't want it, that you're absolutely convinced that the benefits are large and the risks are negligible. I think it's particularly dubious taking second-hand advice from agencies like the Ministry of Health that weren't able to provide a written response to our book and who claim safety even though they cannot point to any health study actually carried out in New Zealand to support their claims. And I think it's equally dubious to accept the word of district health boards who essentially are instructed to support Ministry of Health policies. That's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's equally dubious to accept the exaggerated claims of other fluoridation promoters who have been unwilling to defend their position in open public debate with me, even though I offered to debate any pro-fluoridation dentist, doctor, scientist, or public health official in my last visit to New Zealand in March. I ask you, are you comfortable accepting the advice of those who cannot or will not defend their position in open public debate? I would also suggest to you that if you stop fluoridation, you are depriving no one of fluoride, because if they want fluoride, they can use fluoridated toothpaste, and if there's any concern about low-income families, then that's where the money that you save from the fluoridation chemicals could be spent on providing free toothbrushes, free toothpaste, and better education to low-income families. Now, my final recommendation before I entertain some questions, if we've got any time left, is my recommendation is a fairly conservative one. I recommend, well, obviously I'd hope that you would stop fluoridation immediately, but here's a conservative suggestion. I recommend that you hold fluoridation until such time as the Ministry of Health can successfully rebut all the arguments presented in our book. Not their solo arguments, that they provide answers to their own questions. Let them rebut all the carefully constructed arguments in our book, which is backed up with 80 pages of references to the scientific literature. I'm surprised they haven't done that, but if you make that a requirement, and if they're ever going to do it, they're going to do it then, because they'll need to do that if you want to start fluoridation again. And I think a second requirement is that the promoters must find somebody from either a dental organization, a medical organization, or a public health organization that will have the courage of their convictions and debate me in an open public debate. And if you can find such a person, I will willingly come back to New Zealand and to do that. So now I'm ready for questions if we've got any time left.
Right, councillors, questions to be relayed through you, Jacob, is that right? Yeah. So are there any questions? Yes, Stephanie?
Thank you, Dr. Connaught, and thank you for your patience while we grappled with technology. You say that we, as councillors, we should not accept endorsements from other agencies. If the advice from other agencies was to stop fluoridation, should we ignore that also?
Well, yes, I think there's a... Can I answer?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's a world of difference. I think to proceed with this, you have to have total confidence. To stop it, I don't think you need... It's rather, I always use this analogy. I think fluoridation is like building a dam above a village. Those who build the dam must be absolutely confident and have expertise on every aspect of dam safety. Whereas an individual that looks at the dam, maybe he's a peasant farmer, and looks at the dam, or he has some experience of the soil structure under the dam because of his farming, says, I think there's a weakness here and this dam could break. That single piece of testimony could be sufficient to stop that dam from being built. You have to be able to answer every single scientific study that suggests there may be harm here. And I do not see that the promoters of fluoridation have done that. Instead, they try to nitpick the methodology of studies that suggest harm, and they show no indication, not only in New Zealand, but any other fluoridated country, of attempting to reproduce the studies that have found harm elsewhere. I find that preposterous. If their understanding of epidemiology is so good, why aren't they using the superior understanding and doing their own epidemiological studies to check these IQ studies out, check out the thyroid studies, check out the other...
Right, so I'll probably have a couple of questions. We've just got time for one more question. Is that you, Angela?
Hope so.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Connaught. It's Angela O'Leary here. Thank you for phoning in from such a long way away. Just in your written submission, I'm interested in you in your support of actually chewing gum. You're saying that it's better to encourage the use of fluoride toothpaste and mints containing the sugar xylitol. Is that I'm quite interested in that. Are you saying that if there was some kind of a campaign, perhaps some kind of a health campaign where we distributed fluoride-based toothpaste and gum containing xylitol, that would mitigate the effects of what the other proponents are saying?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I didn't hear all your question clearly, but let me assume that I understand. The first point is yes. If it's a straight choice between putting fluoride in the water or using fluoridated toothpaste, I think the decision is very simple. Obviously, using fluoridated toothpaste minimizes exposure to other tissues, doesn't eliminate it completely, and it also solves the ethical problem of not forcing it on other people. So, but I should point out, in the last 17 years, I personally have not used fluoridated toothpaste, and I would prefer to see the use of xylitol in toothpaste, because xylitol is a natural sugar. We produce it in our own bodies, so we can be pretty certain it's fairly safe. And what it does, it prevents the bacteria that cause tooth decay from sticking to the teeth. And if those bacteria can't stick to the teeth, they can't survive, and they wither away. And not only does the use of xylitol protect the mother, but it also protects the baby, because the mother can spread the bacteria to the baby by licking the teeth or kissing, And if the mother's protecting her oral cavity with xylitol, she will also protect the baby. There's nothing new with xylitol. They've used it in Scandinavia and Japan for over 30 years. And we have experiments going on in this country where we're using xylitol mints in schools in low-income areas.
We might just have to end it there. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And thank you for calling.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, very much.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thanks for talking that up. That was very good. So the next speaker is Bessie Armour. We've got Bessie here. Morning, Bessie. 10 minutes, including questions, thanks.
Good morning, thank you. I've lived in Hamilton since my birth. I had a fairly healthy childhood with no medication apart from the odd Aspro. When I started work, any 3-day absence required a doctor's certificate. I didn't require much medication, but soon found that any can have side effects. The 1950s were early days for antibiotics, and my first experience of antibiotic produced a serious side effect worse than the illness being treated. A prescribed ointment brought my skin out in a rash. A cough syrup caused a weird giddiness. Latest from America was said of a prescribed hormone drug, which did nothing but give me nightmares. Years later, that particular drug was withdrawn from use because of its damage to teenage girls whose mother had taken it when pregnant. One day in our staff room, when I was still working, a fellow worker was most excited about a wonderful sleeping aid she'd discovered and encouraged me and others to use it. It so happened that at that time, I was in the early stages of my first pregnancy. My husband has been forever grateful that I did not follow that woman's advice, for her ideal sleeping aid was none other than thalidomide. When it was proposed to fluoridate Hamilton's water, my unhappy experiences with the little medication I'd had inspired me to write my first ever letter to the editor of the Waikato Times, voicing objection to what I saw as mass medication. I wrote 2 letters, in fact, above the pseudonym Witch's Brew. You could use a pseudonym in those days. Dr. Dennis Rogers was mayor at the time. I had great respect for him and was sure his common sense would keep him from approving such a stupid notion, and was indeed surprised and disappointed when he went along with it. So fluoridation came into Hamilton's water in the mid-60s. About 10 years before, an interesting and outspoken woman doctor and one of New Zealand's earliest women doctors was overseas having alternative treatment for her own cancer when, as a result, she claimed to have found a cure for the disease. This was publicly announced in New Zealand, where it's illegal to say such a thing. On her return to New Zealand, she was arrested at Christchurch Airport as she got off the plane and was prosecuted for making such a statement. The court case was published in newspapers throughout the country. My father read the case and said to me, "If you ever get cancer, that's the person to go to." Dr. Eva Hill was not young. I knew her cancer cure was to do with diet, and I was most curious to find out before she died what it was, thinking if any diet can cure cancer, surely, even better, such a diet may prevent cancer. In 1970, my dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer and had only weeks to live. At the same time, I also had a growth of my own that I was not happy about. It was time for me to find out what this woman advocated if it was not already too late. So I searched out and phoned Dr. Eva Hill in Auckland. When she knew I was ringing from Hamilton, the first thing she said to me was, "Whatever you do, don't drink Hamilton's water." She was an avid opponent of fluoridation and had moved to the outskirts of Auckland to escape the fluoridated water. Her next sentence to me was, "The only cure for cancer is to eat raw food for at least 2 years." My heart sank. That sounded to me like a life sentence. In fact, it is a life sentence in contrast to the death sentence of the disease. She later visited us in Hamilton and shared her advice in a 30-minute consultation. Another of her strong statements was, "Eat your food the way God made it for you, not the way man has mucked it up." I began her recommendations on myself and our sickly 7-year-old who had been on non-stop medication for the previous 6 months. It was a stressful time, for my father was dying. After his funeral, I said to my husband, "Preparing 2 different types of food is rather difficult. How about we give this raw food a 10-day trial with the whole family?" He had listened to Dr. Hill's interview and agreed to try it. So for 10 days, my husband and I and our children ate totally, strictly, only raw food. The improvement in that brief time was impressive. My husband was happy. He lost weight without having to run around the block. The children's tummies all tightened up, which was puzzling, until I recognised the return of strong muscle tone that each had as breastfed babies and had since lost. Dr. Eva Hill had mentioned muscle tone. It dawned on me we were onto a good thing. As a result of that ultra-strict 10-day trial, we changed our family's food in a major way. Today, my husband and I still basically eat raw fruit and vegetables and some cooked. Occasionally, we indulge in other food. One of the first things we did was install a water tank, and for the past 43 years, we have used only rainwater for drinking and cooking. For probably a good 20 years, the family drank it unboiled. Whatever washed into the tank from the roof didn't seem to bother anyone. One day I heard a cat on the roof and decided from then on to boil it. When we changed our food in 1970, we had 4 young children. Another was born about a year later, so from conception he was brought up on a majority of raw food. I asked him recently about a visit he paid to the dentist last year after not seeing one for 10 years. The dentist did 1 small filling and said everything was fine. He has 6 small fillings total. I asked him, had he drunk rainwater when he was growing up or tap water? He replied, only rainwater. He cleaned his teeth with tap water, but that was probably not very often. At no time did he see a doctor for any illness during the 20 years he lived under our care. Now, maybe I could stand for council on a platform advocating raw food diet for all residents of Hamilton. I could try, if elected, to totally ban the sale of cooking equipment, would close all fast food outlets, prohibit the sale in Hamilton of any cooked or processed food, with the possible exception of wholemeal bread, would reduce the amount of pasteurised milk coming into the city, for pasteurised milk is cooked. Dr. Eva Hill said, if you must drink milk, drink only raw milk from a healthy animal. I am certain the health of Hamilton's citizens would improve beyond belief. Waikato Hospital would hopefully be reduced to a fraction of its size, and many GPs, after twiddling their thumbs, would seek work elsewhere. How could I justify such a stance? Well, I personally have proved that this diet works, having seen the results on 2 adults and 5 children over more than 20 years. And because of that, I can say I know what's good for you and I know it works. I know if I were to stand for council on such a platform, I probably wouldn't get a single vote, not even from my husband, who enjoys getting out of his armchair to fix a toaster if someone brings one along. It's an extreme view, and I have no intention of forcing my opinion on anyone, but I see a similarity in the placing of fluoride in the public water supply, a policy of, we know what's good for you, so let's improve the population's health, in this case teeth, through the city's water. My stand today is that I am opposed to the use of fluoride in the public water supply. I have no objection to the water's chemical purification, but am strongly opposed to adding fluoride as mass medication and being involved in paying for it as well. Sure, we currently drink rainwater in our home, but should we move into a retirement village or rest home, we will be obliged to consume fluoridated water. In the meantime, I am most thankful to have lived far longer than I ever expected. My husband and I and our children, brought up mostly on raw food and without fluoride, have enjoyed a blessed and healthy life. I commend to you again Dr. Eva Hill's dictum. Take your food and your water, the way God made it, not the way man's mucked it up. Thank you.
Well done, Bessie. Thank you. Do you mind if I ask you a question of a personal nature? How old are you? And you don't have to answer it.
My children found I didn't like answering that question, but I am 79.
Thank you very much for coming along. Well done. All right, next speaker, Lois. Lois. Good morning, Lois. 10 minutes including questions.
Good morning, councillors, Mayor, committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. My speech is more like a personal reflection. Hydrofluorosilicic acid. I was glad that the vet had trouble saying that word too. It's hard to pronounce and it's even more difficult to swallow. Fluoride added to the water is not the same as fluorine naturally occurring in the soil. So we are lacking fluorine in the soil. Why would we put acid in the water? I graduated as a school dental nurse in 1969, and we were taught during our training that diet, oral hygiene and fluoride went hand in hand in oral health. One of my dental training officers was the late Mr. John Cahoon, and it is interesting to note that Mr. Cahoon, on retirement, went on to study, both here and overseas, the effects of fluoride, and after much study, he became a prominent opponent of fluoridation. In fact, in 1984, 1985, 1987, he found no difference in tooth decay between fluoridated and non-fluoridated communities in New Zealand. I was aware as a young dental nurse that there were opponents to fluoridation, but they were dismissed as mostly American crackpots. And we're only talking about 1 part per million parts of water. How could this possibly be harmful, as these cranks are suggesting? I even argued with the late Dr. Eva Hill at a public meeting in Te Awamutu over 30 years ago, she being against and me for. We were taught in dental school simply that this addition of fluoride, we certainly never heard of hydrofluorosilicic acid, was an amazingly simple answer to prevention of tooth decay, and we did not need to question the matter. Indeed, much later in my life, I queried my dental nurse inspector, the late Miss Jean Bryant, about her thoughts on fluoride, and her answer was, oh, well, we were taught not to question. The reason I asked her her thoughts was because I had misgivings. I'd long since given up fluoridated toothpaste. I drank non-fluoridated water, and I started questioning water fluoridation when so many countries in the world had ceased the practice due to general health concerns from ingestion of fluoride. Dental nurses loved seeing charts, dental charts, with the word fluoride written boldly at the top. But there were a number of occasions when in the secondary tooth of an 11 or 12-year-old, there was the odd catch on the top of the enamel, a little pit, a little catch. And when drilled, there was actually a bog in the dentine below the enamel. A little question mark here. What was going on? What we did not like seeing written at the top of our charts was honey on a dummy. Believe me, that was when you wanted the mother in the chair, not the small child with a mouthful of decaying teeth. Of course, this is about health education. One school I worked in, as I was preparing my steriliser and instruments, I looked out the window before 9 a.m, children eating donuts. They were able to buy them outside the school gate by the donut man. And after a week, I complained to the headmaster, and within a short time, the donut man no longer visited before school. Health education. Getting back to oral hygiene and diet, it seems to me that these are forgotten. Fluoride is the magic. No, it's not. Sugary juices and fizzy drinks are consumed with wild abandon. Processed foods and sugar-laden foods have much to answer for. It's about education. No one is taking away the choice. There are fluoride tablets, fluoride toothpaste, topical application of fluoride by a dental health professional, dentist, which I have heard is considered the most effective fluoride treatment. Acid in our water has no place. And consider this, a bottle-fed baby consumes the equivalent of a 90-kilo person if fluoridated water is used to mix formula. And why wouldn't professionals from the Otago Dental School meet with Dr. Paul Connaught and discuss the topic when he was here in March? There is a saying, he who never changes his mind has learned nothing. Thank you.
Any questions for Lois?
Pardon?
I'm just checking if there's any questions, Lois.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, Margaret?
Yes.
Thank you, Lois. I'm interested in your tenure as a dental nurse at school, and it may be difficult for you to answer, but do you know what the effect of removal of dental nurses had on children's dental health?
Well, we haven't removed dental nurses. We've got dental therapists who still continue to visit the schools. What they did do was take away the job of the dental nurses to do dental health in the classrooms, which I always thought was a very important part from the dental nurses, mainly from the point of view that the dental nurses will, generally we were known as the, what was it? Well, in one school I was known as the Russian front. Murder house, that's right, I had forgotten. Thank you. The murder house. And so it was one way of going and sitting down at the level of the children and talking to them about dental health. And that was sort of taken over, I think, by the teachers. But the dental nurses haven't been removed. They are still in the schools in the mobile caravans. The dental therapists.
The same numbers that they were? I understood there used to be a dental nurse at every school.
Yes, but we used to treat approximately 500 children in a year, seeing them twice a year. I believe the therapists now would see double that number of children. I mean, their equipment has improved. They're using the high-speed drills. They've got X-ray machines. Everything has improved so much that, of course, I think they're still seeing.
We did hear yesterday from, I think it was Sue McFarlane, gave us the stats and information on that.
And dental treatment is still free for children up till the time they leave school. I mean, we haven't lost all of that. I'm talking about our education. We should be educated that we don't rely on fluoride to fix teeth. That's my point. It's about education, right from ground level, sure.
Okay, thank you very much, Lois, for your presentation. Very good. Now, we've got Victoria West. Victoria West. Morning, Victoria. So you've got 10 minutes, including questions.
Good morning. Thank you. I don't have a technical background. I am a graduate from university, so I do have a degree of critical reasoning skills. I am a mother of 2 beautiful children. I've done my reading, and from what I've found of fluoride, I struggle every day knowing that I'm bathing my children in it and giving it to them in their drinking water, knowing what it does. I'm nervous, I'm not a public speaker.
Just talk about the main things you want to say, okay? And we're really interested in hearing what people have to say.
Pretend
we're all naked.
Okay, all right.
No problem, it's not.
Okay. I wanted to keep it simple. So what I did, I went to the dictionary, I looked up fluoride. What's the definition of fluoride? And I took this definition from the Funk and Wagnall's Standard Dictionary, published in New York in 1963. Fluoride, a binary compound of fluorine and another element. Okay, so what's fluorine? Fluorine, a pale, greenish-yellow, intensely pungent and corrosive gaseous element belonging to the halogen group. It's among the most chemically active of the elements. Soluble fluorides, such as hydrofluorosilicic acid, are poisonous. Full stop. I'm aware that hydrofluorosilicic acid has a hazardous substance rating, and is classed as a poison in New Zealand and in other countries around the world. And as such, it is handled with extreme caution. It is labelled with hazardous substance labels and transported in hazardous substance vehicles. I want to know why we have a poison in our drinking water for our children, for our elderly, let alone the rest of us. As counsellors, you're sitting in a position of power. You have the power to remove this, and with that position of power comes a moral obligation for the people that you represent. In the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, it states that everybody has the right to a standard of living for the health and well-being of himself and his family. This includes food and water. We shouldn't have to put up with a poisonous substance in our water. And I'm here on behalf of my family and my children to uphold that right and to speak on behalf of my children. We're now living in a system of accountability, and when you have adequate information and you know better, and you choose to act outside of that, you are held accountable for your actions and the ramifications of those actions and choices. And I'm asking you today, please, you've got the knowledge, you've got the information. Please use your position of power to do the right thing. That's all I have to say.
Very good. You got through that really well, Victoria. Now just wait there, because we're going to have some questions. You can just take a deep breath and relax now. Are there any questions? No, so there's no questions. But you know what? I think you made your point really clearly. I think we definitely got the message you wanted to send us, and we've got your written submission here as well. So thank you very much for doing that and coming along. Well done, you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next person we've got is Cynthia Campbell, and I think, Cynthia, you're going to say something to us in 1 minute. You're going to make 1 point in 1 minute. Go for it.
My name's Cynthia Campbell, and I'm here on behalf of myself and my family too, and I just wish to say that I'm against fluoriding our water. I think it's well, I'm not happy being medicated against my will, and I'd like it to be stopped. Thank you.
Now, the next presenter is Brent Phillips. And so, Brent, you have 10 minutes, including questions.
Technology ready, I'd just like to start off saying thank you to Mayor and councillors for all coming along and giving us as Hamiltonians this opportunity to talk about this issue. A little introduction to myself. I don't have a medical background. My background and my profession at the moment is as a teacher here at Wintec in electrical engineering, and I've been
trying to use some of my spare time to do a bit of research about this fluoride issue. One of the main things that was one of the focuses of my written submission, which I'd like to focus on in my talk today, is about the ethics of fluoridation. And it was quite coincidental that yesterday here at Wintec we had a talk mostly about ethics from the Chief Executive of the Institute of Professional Engineers of New Zealand. He was talking to the students, and also myself as a staff member went along to hear him talking about why ethics was such an important part of any profession. One of the key points that he made was that ethics is always leading ahead of what the requirements of the law are. So at the moment, requirements of the law allow fluoridation of water, but I ask all of you, and I ask you to consider very carefully about what are your ethical principles that you're acting by, and the stakeholders that are involved in this, Hamiltonian residents and visitors to Hamilton. What do they expect of you? This can be a difficult question to answer, but I think it's a very important question. So as a little bit of background to help us think about why this ethical question is so important, we need to know why the fluoride is actually there in the first place, or hydrofluorosilicic acid, so fluoride and a bunch of other chemicals. According to the DHB, it's in there to protect our teeth. That's a direct quote from their website, and I'm sure we've heard earlier in their presentations. And it's there specifically to treat a disease, and that's a very important point. So just to check that this is a correct definition, I've gone to the Oxford English Dictionary, and we can see that, yes, diseases are something that produces specific symptoms or affects a specific location, and it's not a result of physical injury. So yeah, tooth decay affects specifically your teeth, it's not a result of injury. So it fits this definition of a disease. And then following on to medication, what comes naturally next after disease for many of us. So we're using some type of drug or other form, and it's treating the specific disease. And from the thing that we just saw from the Waikato District Health Board, fluoride is there to treat the disease of tooth decay. So this definitions are all working out nicely so far. Another one from the New Zealand Medicine Acts also follows along the same sort of principles, where the medicine is defined, therapeutic purpose for a medicine is being defined, and this all seems to tie in with fluoride, linking up with tooth decay. But the important thing that comes next is what's required by the New Zealand Health and Disability Commissioner. These are the people that set the rules for how medical professionals should act. And given that this is a medical issue, and you are all responsible for deciding on a medical issue, I think this is pertinent that we refer to the rules that are set out for those who are making decisions on medical practices. There's 10 fundamental rights for anyone receiving treatments, and the one that I think in this case is very important, and as others have mentioned, is the right to informed consent. Anyone who is receiving this treatment has the right to say no whenever they want to. And that's the big problem that I see for water fluoridation. It's a medicine that's being put in our water to treat the disease of tooth decay, but we don't have the right to say no to it. So I ask each of you to look very closely at yourselves and say, what is important to me? What is my ethical standards? Look at everybody in this room, everybody that you walk past on the street in Hamilton, or your family and friends. Can I force this onto somebody else? We should have the choice. I'm happy if somebody wants to take fluoride, they can go for it. I don't recommend it, but if they want to have it, they can go for it. Personally, I want the right to say no. I'm sure you're all familiar with the code of conduct that councillors and council employees are obliged to follow. So there's some points that I've taken out from that that hopefully remind you of your obligations. And the issue here is that it's mandatory fluoridation. There's no voluntary aspect in it at all. Fluoride's in there to treat disease. It's therefore a medicine. And if we're receiving a medicine, we have the right to decline that. As councillors, you are elected and obliged to act in an ethical manner, and it's up to each of you to decide how important to me is it to act ethically. Where do I draw the line? I need to see what are the risks and how do things balance out. We've seen in the past things that have been acceptable and then have been ruled as being unacceptable by society and legally unacceptable. But the ethics of these issues always led ahead of the legal requirements. So that's what I'm asking you today, to think about your own ethics for mandatory fluoridation. The law hasn't caught up to what people are asking for, but the ethics should be leading the law. So I ask all of you today to think and to look in the eye, everybody that you see in Hamilton, everybody that visits Hamilton. Do we have the right to force them to take fluoride as a medication for tooth decay? Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Okay, yes, Councillor Hennebury. Microphone.
Sorry. The DHB has suggested that the low dose is not a medicine because of it being a low dose. What is your response?
My response to that would be, what is the purpose of the fluoride being in the water in the first place? And the DHB has put on their website, they've been promoting fluoride is there to treat the disease of tooth decay. And by the pure definitions from the Oxford English Dictionary, from the Medicines Act, anything, any substance or any other treatment that is intended directly to treat a disease means that that substance is a medicine, is a medical treatment. And if we are looking at a medical treatment, then medical ethics should apply.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Brent, for your submission
Thank
and
you,
for your written paper. Right, so we're now at morning tea break, and we will be returning at 10:55. 10:55, okay.